What's up, y'all? Back at it once again. Kicking in for you and for yours. This is Koski of Fun Day. Dropping this knowledge, wisdom, understanding. I'm going to thank my ancestors for that. For, getting the power to do all this. Much love and on the research. We do real scholarship out here. We bring in Black African scholarship back. And one of the first ways we're going to do this is going to this book by Carter Woodson. It's called A Century of Negro Migration. Now, I did one chapter already. We're going to do chapter 2. We're dropping that here for y'all, just hot stuff about what Carter Woodson had to say about our people in this land, going back to, African scholarship. That's what we do. Now, as you see, it says A Century of Negro Migration. Carter Woodson's highlighted right here. Now, I got this from the Babel Trust, Head Trust organization. I'll put the link in here just in case you might already read it yourself. If you don't like my narration of it, I'm just going to spread the wealth around because that's what I do. And this is chapter 2, A Transplantation to the North. Just after the settlement of the questions of the holding the Western Post by the British and the adjustment of the trouble arising from their capture of slaves during our Second War with England, there started a movement of the blacks to this frontier territory. Now, just in case you just know I'm coming back into there, quick sidebar, you know what I'm saying? We talking about the Northwest Territory Ordinance and did it allow, did it not allow slavery? But come to find out, as Carter G. Woodson explained and gave the stats to in the census, there was a lot of black people living there, that got away from slavery and things like that with the French and was living there kicking it. Then when the British took over, this is part we're talking about now. But as there were few towns and cities in the North, let's see where we was at. But as there was few towns and cities in the Northwest during the first decades of the new republic, the fight of the Negro into that territory was like that of a fugitive taking his chances in the wilderness. Having lost their pioneering spirit in a passing through the ordeal of slavery, not many of the bondsmen took flight in that direction. A few free Negroes ventured to seek their fortune in those wilds during the period of the frontier conditions, especially when the country had not undergone a thorough reaction against the Negro. The migration of the Negroes, however, received an impetus early in the 19th century. This came from the Quakers, who by the middle of the 18th century had taken the position that all members of their sex should free their slaves. The Quakers of North Carolina and Virginia had as early as 1740 taken up a question of humanely treating their Negroes. The North Carolina Quakers advised France to emancipate their slaves, later prohibiting the traffic in them, forbade their members from even hiring out blacks in 1780, and by 1818 had exterminated the institution among their communicants. After healing themselves of the sin, they had before the close of the 18th century militantly addressed themselves to the task of abolishing slavery and the slave trade throughout the world. Differing in their scheme from that of what most anti-slavery leaders, they were advocating the establishment of a freeman in society as good as citizens, and to the end have provided for the religious and mental instruction of their slaves prior to emancipating them. Despite the fact that the Quakers were not free to extend their operations throughout the colonies, they did much to enable the Negroes to reach free soil. As the Quakers believed in freedom of the will, human brotherhood, and equality before God, they did not, like the Puritans, find difficulties in solving problems of elevating the Negroes. Where certain Puritans were afraid that conversion might lead to destruction of the caste and incorporation of the undesirable persons into the body of politics, the Quakers proceeded on the principle that all men are brethren, and being equal before God should be considered equal before the law. On the account of unduly emphasizing the relation of man to God, the Puritans atrophied their social humanitarian instinct and developed into a race a self-conscious saints. Believing in human nature and lying stress beyond the relation between man and man, the Quakers became friends of all humanity. In 1693, George Keith, a leading Quaker of his day, came forward as a promoter of religious turning of the slaves as a preparation for emancipation. William Penn advocated emancipation of slaves that they might have every opportunity for improvement. In 1695, the Quakers, while protesting against the slave trade, denounced also the policy of neglecting their moral and spiritual welfare. The growing interest of this sect in the Negroes was shown later by the development of 1713 of a definite scheme for freeing and returning them to Africa after having been educated and trained to serve as missionaries on that continent. When the manumission of the slaves was checked by the reaction against that class, and it became more of a problem to establish them in a hostile environment, certain Quakers of North Carolina and Virginia adopted the scheme of settling them in northern states. At first, they sent such freemen to Pennsylvania, but for various reasons, this did not prove to be the best asylum. In the first place, Pennsylvania bordered on the slave states Maryland and Virginia, from which agents came to kidnap free Negroes. Furthermore, many Negroes were already rushing to that commonwealth as the Negro heaven, and there was a chance that Negroes might be settled elsewhere in the North, where they might have had better economic opportunities. A committee of 40 was accordingly appointed to the North Carolina Quakers in 1822. To examine the laws of other free states with a view to determine what section would be most suitable for colonizing these blacks. This committee recommended on this report that blacks be colonized to Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. The yearly meeting therefore ordered the removal of such Negroes as fast as they was willing or might be consistent with the profession of their sect, and instructed the agents effective removal to draw on the treasury for any sum not exceeding $200 to defray the expenses. An increased number reached these states every year, but owing to the inducements offered by the American Colonization Society, some of them went to Liberia. When Liberia, however, developed into everything but a haven of rest, the numbers sent to the settlements in the Northwest greatly increased. The quarterly meeting succeeded in sending to the West 133 Negroes, including 23 free blacks and slaves given up because they were connected by marriage with those to be transplanted. The Negro colonists seemed to be preferred Indiana. They went in 3 companies, and it was suitable young friends to whom they executed power of attorney to manumit, settle, free, and settle and bind them out. 13 carts and wagons were brought for these 3 companies. $1,250,000 were furnished for their traveling expenses and clothing. The whole amounts to $2,490,000. I'm not glad time reading the numbers. 2,490. It is planned to send 40 or 50 to Long Island and 20 to the interior of Pennsylvania, but they failed to prosper, and reports concerning them stamped them as destitute and deplorably ignorant. Those who went to Ohio and Indiana, however, did well. We later received another interesting account of this exodus. David White led a company of 53 into the West, 38 of whom belonged to the Friends, 5 to a member who had orders that they be taken west at his expense. 6 of these slaves belonged to Samuel Lawrence, a Negro slaveholder who purchased himself and family. White pathetically reports in the case of the 4 of the women who had been married slave husbands and the 20 children for they had possession of whom the Friends had to stand a lawsuit in court. The women had decided to leave their husbands behind, but thought a separation so tormented them that they made an effort to secure their liberty. Upon appealing to their master for terms, the owners, somewhat moved by compassion, sold them for one half of their value. Whites then went to the west and left 4 in Chillicothe, which is Ohio, 23 in Leesburg, and 26 in Wayne County, Indiana, without encountering any material difficulties. Others had actually thought of this plan, but the Quaker had carried out on a small scale. Here we see again not only the desire to have the Negro emancipated, but the vital interest of the Quakers in the success for the blacks, for members of the sex, not only liberated their slaves, but sold out their holdings in the South and then moved these bondsmen into the North. Quakers who then lived in free states offer fugitive material assistance by open and clandestine methods. The most prominent leader developed by the movement was Levi Coffin, who daring deeds on behalf of the fugitives made him a reputed president of the Underground Railroad. Most of the Quaker settlement of Negroes with which he had connected were made in what is now Hamilton, Howard, Wayne, Randolph, Burgle, Gibson, Grant, Rush, in Tipton counties, Indiana, and Drake County, Ohio. The promotion of this movement by the Quakers was well on its way by 1815. It was not materially checked until the 50s when the operation of the drastic fugitive slave law inferred. And even when the movement had gained such momentum and the execution of such mischievous measures had produced in the North so much reaction like that expressed in the personal liberty laws that it can only be stopped. Negroes found home in Western New York, Western Pennsylvania, and throughout the Northwest Territory. The Negro population of York, Harrisburg, and Philadelphia rapidly increased. A settlement of Negroes developed on the Sandy Lakes in northwestern Pennsylvania. So there's a settlement of Negroes in Sandy Lake, northwest Pennsylvania. There was another one near Berlin Crossroads in Ohio. A group of Negroes migrating to this same state found homes in Van Buren Township of Shelby County. A more significant settlement in the state was made by Samuel Just, an Englishman possessing extensive plantations in Hanover, Elmhurst, and Henrico counties, Virginia. He provided in his will that his slaves should be free and sent north. He further provided that the revenue from his plantation the last year of his life to be applied to building schoolhouses and churches for their accommodation, and that all the money coming to him in Virginia to be set aside for the appointment of the ministers and teachers to instruct them. In 1818, Wickham, the executor of his estate, purchased land and established these Negroes in what was called the upper and lower camps of Brown County. August Wattles, a Quaker from Connecticut, made a settlement in Mercer County, Ohio, early in the 19th century. In the winter of 1833 to 1834, he provincially became acquainted with colored people of Cincinnati, finding there was about 4,000 totally ignorant of the very thing calculated to make good citizens. Most of them had been slaves and excluded from every avenue of moral and mental improvement. He established for them a school which he maintained for 2 years. Then proposed to these Negroes to go into the country and purchase land to remove them from those contaminating influences which had long so crushed them in our cities and villages. They consented on the condition that he would accompany them and teach school. He traveled throughout Canada, Michigan, and Indiana, looking for suitable location, and finally selected a settlement in the place of Mercer County, Ohio. In 1835, he made a first purchase of land there for this purpose, and before 1838, Negroes had brought about 30,000 acres at the earnest appeal of this benefactor, who all had traveled into almost every neighborhood of blacks in the state and laid before them the benefits of a permanent home for themselves and education for their children. This settlement was further increased in 1858 by the manumitted slaves of John Harper of North Carolina. John Randolph of Rocane endeavored to establish his slaves as free men in this county. But the Germans who had settled in that community a little ahead of them started such a disturbance that Randolph's executor could not carry out his plan, although he had purchased a large tract of land there. It was necessary to send these freemen to Miami County. Theodoric H. Gregg of Denwood County, Virginia, liberated his slaves in 1854 and sent them to Ohio. Nearer to the Civil War, when public opinion was prescribing the uplift of the Negroes in Kentucky, Noah Spears secured Zena Green County, Ohio, a small parcel of land for 16 of his former bondsmen in 1856. Other freemen found their way to this community, and years later, it became so prosperous that it was selected as the site of Wilberforce University. Did not know that. This transplantation extended into Michigan. With the help of persons philanthropically inclined, there sprang up a flourishing group of Negroes in Detroit. Early in the 19th century, they began to acquire property and provide for the education of their children. Their record was such as to merit the encomiums of their fellow white citizens. In later years, this group in Detroit was increased by the operation of the laws hostile to the free Negroes in the South, and that life for this class not only became intolerable, but a necessity their expiration. Because of Virginia's drastic laws, and especially that of 1838, prohibiting the return of that state of such Negro students as been accustomed to go north to attend school. After they were denied this privilege at home, the father of Richard Baptiste and Mary Louise Moore, the mother of Fanny M. Richards, led a colony of free Negroes from Fredericksburg to Detroit. And for about the similar reasons, the father of Robert H. Pelham conducted others from Petersburg, Virginia, in 1859. One Saunders, a planter of Cobble County, West Virginia, liberated his slaves some years later and furnished them homes among the Negroes settled there in Cass County, Michigan, about 90 miles east of Chicago and 95 miles west of Detroit. This settlement had become attractive to the fugitive slaves and freemen because Quakers settled there welcomed them on their way to freedom, and in some cases encouraged them to remain among them. When the increase of the fugitives was rendered impossible during the 50s, when the fugitive slave law was being enforced, there was still a steady growth due to manumission of slaves by sympathetic and benevolent masters in the South. Most of these Negroes settled in Calvin Township in that county, so that is 1,376 residing there. In 1860, 795 was established in the district, there being only 508 whites dispersed among them. Negro settlers did not then attain control of the government, but they early purchased land to the extent of several thousand acres and developed into successful small farmers. Being a little more prosperous than the average Negro community in the North, the Cass County settlement not only attracted Negroes fleeing from hardships in the South, but also those who had yearned for an unsuccessful endeavor to establish themselves in other communities on free soil. These settlements were duplicated, okay? So this wasn't the only one. During this before the Civil War, and this in the Northwest Territory. So this wasn't the only one. We just got through in Michigan. We're going to look at Ohio. We're going to look at Illinois. These settlements were duplicated. A little farther west in Illinois, Edward Cole, a Virginian who in 1818 migrated to Illinois, of which he served as governor and as liberated from slavery, settled his slaves in that Commonwealth, having brought them to Edwardsville, where they constituted a community known as Cole Negroes. There was another community of Negroes in Illinois, what is now called Brooklyn, situated north of East St. Louis. This town was a center of some consequences in the 30s. It became a station of the Underground Railroad en route to Alton and into Canada. As all the Negroes who emerged from the South did not go further into the North, the Black population of the town grew gradually despite the fact that slave hunters captured and re-enslaved many of the Negroes who settled there. These settlements, together with favorable communities of sympathetic whites, promoted a migration of free Negroes and fugitives from the South by serving as centers, offering assistance to those fleeing into the free states and to Canada. Fugitives usually found friends in Philadelphia, Columbia, Pittsburgh, Elmira, Rochester, Buffalo, Gallipolis, Portsmouth, Akron, Cincinnati, and Detroit. They passed on their way to freedom through Columbia, Philadelphia, Elizabethtown, and by way of sea to New York and Boston, from which they proceeded to permanent settlements in the North. In the West, the migration of the Black was further facilitated by particular geographic conditions, and that the Appalachian highland, extended like a peninsula into the South, had a natural endowment which produced a class of white citizens hostile to the institution of slavery. These mountaineers, coming later into the colonies, had to go into the hills and mountains because of the first comers of Europe had taken most of the land near the sea. Being a German and Scottish Irish Protestant Presbyterian stock, they had differently wildly from those of the seaboard horde slaveholders. The mountaineers believed in civil liberty and fee simple and an open road to civil honors, securing the poorest and feeblest member of society. The Eastern element had, for their ideas of government, the interest for the people. They believe in liberty, but not that of kings, lords, and commoners, not of all the people. Settled along the Appalachian Highland, these new stocks continue to differ from those dwelling near the sea, especially on the slavery question. Natural endowment of the mountaineers, of the mountainous section made slavery there unprofitable, and the mountaineers bore it grievously that they were attached to commonwealths dominated by the radical pro-slavery element of the South, who sacrificed all other interests to safeguard those of the particular institution. There developed a number of clashes in all of the legislators and constitutional conventions in southern states along the Atlantic. But in every case, the defenders of the interests of slavery won. When therefore the slaves began, with the assistance of anti-slavery, mountaineers began to escape to the free states, they had little difficulty in making their way through the Appalachian region, where the love of freedom had so set the people against slavery that although some of them yielded to the inevitable sin, they never made any systematic effort to protect it. The development of the movement in these mountains was more than interesting. During the first quarter of the 19th century, there were many ardent anti-slavery leaders in the mountains. They were not particularly interested in the Negro, but determined to keep that soil for freedom, that the settlers might realize the ideas for which they had left their homes in Europe. When the Industrial Revolution, with the intended rise of the plantation cotton culture, made abolition in the South unprofitable, some of them became colonizationists, hoping to destroy the institution through deportation, which would remove the object of certain masters who would not free their slaves, provided they were not left, and the states become a public charge. A public charge meaning being on welfare. Some of the sentiments continued into the mountains even until the Civil War. The Highlanders, therefore, found themselves involved in continuous imbroglio because they were not moved by reactionary influences, which were unifying the South for its bold effort to make slavery a national institution. The other members of the Mountaineers anti-slavery group became attached to the Underground Railroad system, endeavoring by a secret method to place on free soil a sufficient large number of fugitives to show demonstration in the South. John Brown, who communicated with the South through these mountains, thought that his work would be successful. if he could change the situation in one country in each of these, one county in each of these states. The lines along which these Underground Railroad operators moved connected naturally with the Quaker settlements established in the free states and made favorable sections in the Appalachian region. Many of these workers were Quakers who had already established settlements of slaves on estates which they purchased in the Northwest Territory. Among these was John Rankin, James Gillihan, Jesse Lockhart, Robert Dobbins, Samuel Carruthers, Hugh L. Fullerton, and William Dickey. Thus, they are connected to the heart of the South with the avenues of freedom in the North. There were routes extending from this section into Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Pennsylvania. Over the Ohio and Kentucky group, culminating chiefly into Cleveland, Sandusky, and Detroit. However, more fugitives made their way to freedom than any other avenue, partly too because they found limestone caves very helpful for hiding by day. These operations extended even through Tennessee into northern Georgia and Alabama. Dillingham, Josiah Henderson, and Harriet Tubman used these routes to deliver many a Negro from slavery. The opportunity thus to offer help to the oppressed brought forward a class of anti-slavery men who went beyond the limit of merely expressing their horror of the evil. They believed that something should be done to deliver the poor that cry and to direct the wanderer in the right way. Translated into action, what has been restricted to an academic discussion, these philanthropic workers ushered in a new era in the uplift of Blacks, making abolition more a reality. The abolition element of the North can no longer be considered an insignificant minority, advocating a hopeless cause, but a factor in drawing from the South a part of its slave population at the time of offering asylum to the free Negroes, whom the Southerners considered undesirable. Prominent among those who had aided this migration in various ways was Benjamin Ludd of Tennessee and James G. Brinkley, a former slaveholder of Huntsville, Alabama, who manumitted his slaves and apprenticed and educated some of them in Ohio. This exodus of Negroes to the free states promoted the migration of others of their race to Canada, a more congenial part beyond the borders of the United States. The movement from the free states into Canada, moreover, was contemporary with that of the South to the free states, as will be evidenced by the fact that 1,500 of the 60,000 Negroes in Canada in 1860 were born free. As Detroit was the chief gateway for them into Canada, most of these refugees settled in town on southern Ontario, not far from that city. They were Dawn, Colchester, Elgin, Dresden, Windsor, which is right across Detroit, Sandwich, Bush, Wilberforce, Hamilton, St. Catharines, Chatham, Raleigh, Irwinton, London, Madeline, and Gonfield. This is where the I-94, if you ride on the I-94, it connects to the 405 going into Canada. On the way up, these cities are on the way up going to Toronto. And their coming into Canada was not checked even by requests from their enemies that they be turned away from that country as undesirables. For some of the white population, they're welcome and assisted them. Canadians later experienced a change in their attitude towards these refugees, but British Americans never made life of the Negro there so intolerable as was in the case of some free states. It should be observed here that this movement, unlike the exodus of Negro of today, affected an unequal distribution of enlightened Negroes. Those who are freeing from the South today are largely laborers seeking economic opportunities. The motive and the work in the mind of the Alabama refugees was higher. In 1840, there was some more intelligent Black in the South than in the North, but not so after 1850, despite the vigorous execution of the fugitive slave laws in some parts of the North. While free Negro populations of the slave states increased only to 23,736 from 1850 to 1860. That of the slaves, other free states increased to 29,839. In the South, only Delaware, Maryland, and North Carolina showed a noticeable increase in the numbers of free persons of color during the decade immediately preceding the Civil War. This element of the population only slightly increased in Alabama, Kentucky, Missouri, Tennessee, Virginia, Louisiana, South Carolina, and the District of Columbia. The number of free Negroes in Florida remained constant. Those of Arkansas, Mississippi, and Texas diminished. In the North, of course, the migration had caused the tendency to be in the other direction. With the exception of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and New York, which had about the same free colored population in 1860 as it had in 1850, there was a general increase in the number of Negroes in free states. Ohio led in this respect, having during this time an increase of 11,394. A glance at the table accompanying this page will show the details of migration. Now, this is the details of migration, and it uses a census of 1850 to 1860. And as you see right here, how it goes, Alabama, Arkansas, California was a tremendous jump. Was a big jump in 10 years in California. This one, Arkansas, went down, as you see. So there's a lot in Delaware, as you see. Florida didn't go nowhere. Kansas, there wasn't no census. Minnesota, there wasn't no census. Colorado, Dakota, there was none. And you see Dakota, there was no black people. All right. We can look at the census. So that's chapter 2. And show you where these the majority of free people, free color people, or free black people in the United States is 400,300. It's close to 500,000. A little bit under 500,000 of free black people. So in 1850, and that's the number right here at the bottom. So that's where we are right about now. Remember, this is the thing of free black people. So in the Constitution, how was it law that every slave counts as a half or something like that? 3/5. 3/5 is a man. So you got to count the number different in the other things when it comes to count the slave population. All right. So we getting them back. That's what we're talking about. Carter G. Woodson. All this stuff comes from this book right here. That's chapter 2 of Essential Negro Migration from the late great Honorable Carter G. Woodson. The reason why we have Black History Month. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel. We're gonna keep on going through this book during the week. That's a new series right now we're working on. And much love to you and yours. So, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Peace.